Today I am replacing the rear brake pads on a 2015 Kia Cadenza. It does have the electronic parking brake, and that requires some consideration. For this job, you'll need new rear pads, wheel chocks to chock the front wheels, jack stand, brake lube, 14mm ratchet or box wrench, a 4mm hex wrench, T40 Torx for the parking brake, some brake cleaner, and a C-clamp. Right. Now, I go on the assumption that you know how to jack up a car if you're looking at this video, so make sure you find the proper jack points, use your manual, make sure you use jack stands, and remember to use those wheel chocks for safety. So pull off the wheel after you've done those things, safety first. Once you get to the caliper, there are two 14mm screws on the back of the caliper. Those two have to come out. While you're in here, check the rotors for scoring. If they're heavily scored, those rotors are going to need to be changed as well. Mine look pretty good, so I was just looking to change the pads. When you get the caliper off, if you've done brake jobs on other cars, the first thing you'll notice is this gigantic module right here on the back. That module is the electronic parking brake module. A number 4 hex key will take off the 2 screws that attach it to the back of the caliper. Remove these 2 screws. After you remove these 2 screws, the electronic module will come off pretty easily. It's connected with a spline system, so you'll see it right away when you pull it off. Now, these electronic brake modules are on both back brakes, so be prepared to pull them both off. Now, for me, these back brakes hadn't been done in 70,000 miles, so they were hard to get off. So I put anti-seize on both the 14mm going back in and these smaller hex key screws. I put a little bit of anti-seize, so when I have to do this again, this won't be a fight. Although they weren't that bad to come off this time. Once you get those 2 screws out, you remove the module, shake it a little bit. You might need use a little screwdriver, but be very careful not to damage this module. And watch your brake lines. See how I balanced the caliper on top of the axle. So once it came off, then you'll see the spline. Now, in some cars, you can use a hex key for this. On this particular car, upon closer inspection, this was not a hex key. This was that Torx. I believe it's a Torx 40. You stick it in and screw it clockwise. And you'll screw it clockwise until it stops. When it stops, pull it out. At that point, you'll be ready to compress the caliper like you do any other brake job. Right? Pull out an old pad, and if you have a C-clamp, it's time to pull out your C-clamp or your caliper compressor, which is what I'm using. You just put the old pad in there up against the caliper and compress it. It will compress fully now. Now, if you don't screw in the emergency brake like I just showed you, this will not compress. So you can press that all the way down. Be careful of the caliper boot. Don't tear that rubber boot. Be very careful. So screw it slowly but firmly. It should go all the way back down like any other caliper. When you get done, it will be ready for remounting. Right? So for me, then I finished pulling the other pad. Right? I changed the pads and the hardware. I'm going to skip that step because they go on the same way they came off. You put them on, there's hardware at the bottom and the top. Hardware is cheap, so I just replaced it anyway, even though this hardware was good. I put the electronic brake module back on with those 2 screws. All right, and then 2 new brake pads went in pretty easily. Make sure you grease the back of the, lightly grease the back of the pads so that the caliper will move freely. Lightly grease and use specified brake lube. Don't just use WD-40, something crazy like that. You're gonna have a problem. All right, if you are uncomfortable with any of this, get a mechanic. After that, the caliper goes right back on. The 14mm screws go back in the back. A little bit of anti-seize. I say use the torque specs. You can look them up online what the torque specs are, so you can spec these screws out to 14mm. They just need to be snug. They don't need to be, gorilla tight. And once they're back, you're done. Put the wheels back on. All right. Do both sides. Make sure to pump the brakes several times before you just take off down the road. All right. And one more thing I did was I tested the emergency parking brake before I left. Everything worked well. Did an operational check, drove around the block several times. All is good.